Honey, I'm gonna need you to step away from the host stand. I've told you twice now, there is no reservation under that name. You are blocking the entrance for our actual guests.
Pamela did not move. She was standing in the foyer of Maison Verlaine, the three-Michelin-star French restaurant on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and she was looking at the maître d' with the particular calm that comes from having heard variations of this exact sentence many times before. The maître d' was Anthony. He was 42 years old, with slick black hair combed straight back, a navy three-piece suit that had been tailored to his exact dimensions, and the practiced sneer of a man who had spent 18 years controlling the front door of restaurants where controlling the front door was understood, by everyone in the industry, to be the most important job in the building. He held a leather reservation book in his left hand. His right hand was already pointing toward the door. Pamela had walked through that door 11 minutes earlier. She was wearing a simple beige sheath dress, low nude heels, and a small clutch. Her hair was in a glossy shoulder-length blowout. She wore small gold stud earrings and one thin gold bracelet. She had given Anthony the name on her reservation. She had given him the time. She had given him the confirmation number that had been emailed to her 3 days earlier. Anthony had looked at her. He had not looked at the reservation book. He had told her there was no reservation under that name. Pamela had asked him, calmly, to check the system. He had told her, more loudly, that he had already checked the system and that she needed to step away from the host stand. A couple in formal wear had walked in behind her. Anthony had greeted them with a warmth that was so different from the tone he had used with Pamela that it was almost theatrical. He had walked them to their table personally. He had returned to the host stand to find Pamela still standing there. "Ma'am. I am not going to ask you again." A diner at table 4 had raised her phone slightly above her water glass. Not openly. Just enough to record. A man at table 7 was watching the exchange over the rim of his wine glass with the expression of someone who had already decided that this was not his problem. A waiter passing with a tray of amuse-bouches slowed his steps just enough to hear what came next, then kept walking, his face carefully blank. Pamela placed her clutch on the host stand. She did this slowly, deliberately, the way you place down something that you do not want anyone to misread as a threatening gesture. She folded her hands on top of it. Anthony. The use of his name surprised him. She had read it off his small brass name tag. He had not introduced himself. He blinked. "My reservation is in your system. I made it 11 days ago through your online booking portal. I received an email confirmation on the same day. I received a text reminder yesterday afternoon. The reservation is under the name Foster, party of 1, 8:30, table preference quiet. I would like you to open the reservation book in your hand and find it. I am not leaving until you do." Anthony's face did something complicated. The sneer flickered for half a second before resetting itself. "Ma'am, I have already checked. There is no reservation under that name. I don't know what you think is going to happen if you keep standing here, but I can assure you it isn't going to end with me seating you. This is a 3-Michelin-star restaurant. We have specific standards. Now please. Step away from the stand." What Anthony did not know, what he was about to learn in the next 12 minutes in a way that would, 6 months from now, end his career in the hospitality industry permanently and cost his employer approximately $14 million in annual revenue, was that the reservation was, in fact, in the system. He had not opened the book. He had not checked the tablet on the host stand. He had glanced at Pamela for less than 2 seconds when she had walked in, and his brain had performed an instantaneous calculation that he had not been aware of performing. The calculation had produced an answer. The answer had been wrong demographic for this room. The default had executed before he had even looked down. He was about to find out which demographic he had just refused. Pamela was 41 years old. She had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina. She had a doctorate in food science from UC Davis, a master's degree in hospitality management from Cornell, and 17 years of experience as a working chef in 3 different countries before she had been recruited, 6 years ago, into a position so confidential that even her own husband had been required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before she could fully explain what she did for a living. She was the lead anonymous inspector for the Michelin Guide North America. She was at Maison Verlaine tonight for the restaurant's 3-star reassessment. She had been in the dining room for 11 minutes without ever being seated. And across the room, at table 12, a man in a charcoal gray suit was setting down his fork. He was watching the exchange at the host stand. He had recognized Pamela the moment she walked in. He was her colleague. He was also a Michelin inspector. He was dining at Maison Verlaine tonight, anonymously, for the same reason she was. He folded his napkin. He placed it on the table. He stood up. To understand what was about to happen in that candlelit dining room, you need to understand who Pamela actually was, because the assumption Anthony had made about her in less than 2 seconds was wrong in every possible direction, and the cost of that assumption was about to be calculated in stars, in dollars, and in a career that had been 30 years in the making and was about to end in a single evening. Pamela was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1984, the only daughter of a couple who ran a small soul food restaurant on the corner of Spring Street and Cumming Street for 36 years. Her father, Charles, did the cooking. Her mother, Lorraine, ran the front of the house. The restaurant had 42 seats. It served collard greens, fried catfish, shrimp and grits, red rice, and a peach cobbler that her grandmother had taught her father to make when he was 19 years old. The restaurant was not famous. It had never been written up in a national publication. It had simply, quietly, fed its neighborhood for 3.5 decades. Pamela had grown up in that restaurant. She had been standing on a milk crate next to the stove at the age of 4, watching her father season a cast-iron skillet. She had been taking orders at the age of 7, because her mother had taught her that hospitality was not about pretending to be friendly. It was about actually paying attention. She had been chopping onions at the age of 9, because her father had told her that anyone who could not chop an onion correctly had no business calling themselves a cook. By the time she was 16 years old, she could break down a whole chicken in under 90 seconds, run the line during a Saturday night rush, and read a dining room the way her mother had taught her to read a dining room, which was to say, completely, in less than a glance, picking up on which tables were happy, which tables were waiting too long, which tables had a child who was about to cry, and which tables contained a customer who was about to be difficult. Her mother had taught her something else, too. Something more specific. Something that was going to be relevant tonight. There was a particular Saturday afternoon, when Pamela was 12 years old, when a couple had walked into the restaurant during the lunch rush. The husband had taken one look at the menu, one look at the dining room, one look at the customers, most of whom were black, the majority of whom were from the neighborhood, and he had said, loudly, in a voice that had carried across the room, "Honey, I don't think this is the kind of place we want to eat at." Her mother had been at the host stand. Her mother had heard him. Her mother had smiled. The smile had not reached her eyes. She had walked across the dining room, picked up 2 menus, and said, "Sir, I think you're right. I don't think this is the kind of place you want to eat at. I'm going to recommend a diner 2 blocks down. They have a parking lot. The food is exactly what you're looking for. Have a lovely afternoon." She had walked the couple to the door. She had held the door open for them. She had waited until they were on the sidewalk before she had turned back to the dining room and continued with the lunch service as if nothing had happened. Pamela had been 12 years old. She had been standing next to the cash register. She had asked her mother, later that night, why she had not been angrier. Why she had not said something sharper. Why she had let the man walk out without making him feel ashamed. Her mother had been wiping down the host stand. She had not stopped wiping. She had said, "Baby. There are 2 kinds of power in this world. There is the kind that needs you to know it's there, and there is the kind that doesn't. The first kind is loud. It performs. It shouts. It makes a scene. The second kind is quiet. It just decides. That man walked out of here without ever knowing he had been put out. He thought he was the one who had decided. He wasn't. I was. The kind of power that matters is the kind that doesn't need the other person to know it happened. Her mother had paused. She had looked at Pamela. Someday, baby, you are going to be in a room where someone makes a decision about you the way that man tried to make a decision about us. And you are going to remember everything I have just told you. And you are going to handle it the right way. Not the loud way. The right way. Because the loud way changes nothing. The right way changes everything. Pamela had been 12 years old. She had not fully understood. By the time she was 20, she understood it the way some people understand religion, completely, without needing it explained again. She had gone to culinary school at the Culinary Institute of America. She had then gone to Cornell for hospitality management. She had then gone to UC Davis for her doctorate in food science. She had worked in 3-Michelin-star kitchens in Paris, in Tokyo, and in San Sebastian. She had been on the verge of opening her own restaurant in New York 7 years ago when she had received a phone call from a recruiter who had refused to identify the position over the phone and had asked her to fly to Chicago for an in-person interview. The position had been with the Michelin Guide. The interview had lasted 6 hours. She had been hired 3 weeks later. She had been promoted to lead inspector for North America 4 years after that. She had eaten in the most exclusive dining rooms in the country. She had never once, in 6 years, been recognized. Tonight was not going to be the first time. But tonight was going to be the last time Anthony ever worked in a restaurant. Now you need to understand Anthony, because what was about to happen in that dining room was not random. It was the predictable, almost mathematical result of a man who had spent 18 years building a career on the conviction that the front door of a restaurant was a filter, and that his job, the most important job in the building, was to operate that filter with absolute confidence. Anthony was 42 years old. He had started in the hospitality industry at the age of 23, working as a busser at a midtown steakhouse where the maitre d' had been a man named Vincent who had taught him everything he believed he knew about running a dining room. Vincent had been 71 years old at the time, and he had been working the front door of New York restaurants since 1972. Vincent had taught Anthony 3 things. The first was that a great maitre d' knew, the moment a guest walked through the door, exactly where in the dining room they belonged. The second was that the front door of a fine dining restaurant was not a public space. It was a stage, and the maitre d' was both the director and the gatekeeper. The third was that the most important guests were the ones who had been guests before, and that the maitre d', who could remember faces, names, anniversaries, and dietary restrictions would never be unemployed in this city. Vincent had also taught him, in subtler ways, who the most important guests tended to be. He had not said this part out loud. He had not needed to. Anthony had learned it by watching. He had watched which tables Vincent had given to which guests for 7 years. He had absorbed the pattern. The pattern had become a template. The template had become a default. Anthony had moved from the steakhouse to a French bistro, from the bistro to a sushi temple, from the sushi temple to a modern American restaurant that had earned 2 Michelin stars in its 2nd year of operation. He had been recruited to Maison Verlaine 4 years ago by the owner, a man named Robert Verlaine, who had told him, during the final interview, that he was looking for a maitre d' who understood that Maison Verlaine was not for everyone. Anthony had nodded. He had understood exactly what Robert meant. They had shaken hands. Anthony had started the following Monday. In the 4 years since he had taken the position, Anthony had refused entry, claimed false reservation system errors, or quietly steered toward less desirable tables a number of guests that he had stopped counting. The pattern of those guests had a specific demographic skew. Anthony had not consciously tracked the skew. He had told himself, on the rare occasions when he had reflected on it at all, that he was simply protecting the atmosphere of the restaurant. That he was preserving the experience for the regulars. That the diners who paid $400 per person before wine for a 3-star meal had certain expectations, and that those expectations included a particular kind of room. He had never been called out for any of it. The few guests who had pushed back over the years had either left in frustration or had been managed by Robert Verlaine himself, who had a gift for making people feel both apologized to and gently informed that perhaps Maison Verlaine was not the right fit for their needs. The restaurant had 3 Michelin stars. It had a 6-month waiting list. It had been profiled in 3 glossy magazines in the past year alone. There had been no consequences, ever, for any of Anthony's decisions at the door. He had become, by the time Pamela walked into the foyer that Tuesday evening, a man who had not been told no in 18 years. What Anthony did not know, and what he was about to learn in a manner that would replay in his head for the rest of his life, was that the Michelin Guide had been receiving complaints about the front-of-house culture at Maison Verlaine for the past 16 months. The complaints had been quiet. They had been filed through the Guide's online feedback portal. They had been written in the careful, professional language of people who knew that direct accusations of racial bias against a 3-star restaurant would not be taken seriously, and so had instead described, in precise and dispassionate detail, the specific patterns of treatment they had received as guests. The complaints had accumulated in a file. The file had been reviewed by Pamela personally 3 months ago. She had decided, after reading every complaint twice, that the restaurant's 3-star reassessment, which had been scheduled for the following spring, would be moved up. She had also decided that she would conduct the reassessment herself, anonymously, as a single diner, in clothing and presentation that would test whether the patterns described in the complaints were accurate. She had booked the reservation 11 days ago under her real name. She had not used an alias. She had wanted to see what would happen with her actual name, which was a name that gave no indication of who she was professionally and which had not, to her knowledge, ever appeared in any industry publication. The reservation had been in the system. She had received the confirmation. She had received the reminder. She had walked through the door at 8:25 for an 8:30 seating. Anthony had taken less than 2 seconds to look at her. The 2 seconds had cost him everything. Across the room, at table 12, Donald was now standing. He was walking toward the host stand. He was holding, in his right hand, a small leather-bound notebook with a red cover. The red cover was not visible to most of the room. But Anthony was about to see it. Donald did not hurry. He never did. He had been a Michelin inspector for 14 years, and one of the first things he had learned in the job was that hurrying drew attention, and drawing attention was the one thing an anonymous inspector could not afford to do. So he walked across the dining room at the unremarkable pace of a man who had simply finished his first course and was going to the restroom, or stepping out to take a phone call, or having a quiet word with the manager about a wine that had not been quite right. He was 63 years old. He had silver hair, a neatly trimmed silver beard, and the kind of face that people forgot within an hour of meeting him. He was, by his own assessment and by the assessment of the people who had hired him, perfectly designed for his job. He had been a sommelier in San Francisco for 20 years before joining the Guide. He had been recruited the same way Pamela had been recruited, through a discreet phone call, a confidential interview, and a non-disclosure agreement that was 31 pages long. He was Pamela's closest colleague at the Guide. They spoke on the phone 3 times a week. They had eaten in approximately 400 restaurants together over the past 6 years, always at separate tables, always without acknowledging each other in the room. The protocol was strict. Inspectors did not recognize other inspectors in public. Ever. Under any circumstances. Donald was about to break that protocol. He had been seated at table 12 for 58 minutes. He had ordered the 8-course tasting menu with the wine pairing. He had been served the first 3 courses. He had taken his standard notes on his phone under the table, photographed each dish at a precise angle, and had been preparing to write his preliminary impressions of the amuse-bouche when Pamela had walked through the door. He had recognized her instantly. He had also, instantly, understood why she was there. She had told him, 2 weeks ago, that she was moving up the Maison Verlaine reassessment because of the complaint file. He had agreed with the decision. He had not known she would be there tonight. He had been working a different assignment in the city. He had watched, from table 12, as Anthony had taken less than 2 seconds to look at her. He had watched Anthony's face do the thing that Anthony's face had been doing for 18 years. He had watched Anthony not check the reservation book. He had watched Anthony's finger come up and point toward the door. He had set down his fork on the 11-second mark. He had folded his napkin on the 20-second mark. He had stood up on the 45th mark, which was the moment, in his professional judgment, that Anthony had crossed from a single bad decision into a documented pattern that the restaurant could no longer be permitted to recover from. He arrived at the host stand now. He stopped 2 feet from Pamela. He did not look at her. He looked at Anthony. "Good evening. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'd like to speak with the executive chef." Anthony blinked. The request was not part of any script he had prepared for. Guests did not, as a rule, ask to speak with the executive chef. They asked to speak with the manager. They asked for the sommelier. They asked, occasionally and obnoxiously, for the owner. They did not ask for the chef. "Sir, the chef is in the middle of service. May I ask what this is regarding? I can have the floor manager come over to your table to address any concerns." Donald looked at Anthony for a long moment. He did not smile. He did not glare. He simply looked at him with the calm, evaluative attention of a man who had spent 14 years walking into restaurants and being underestimated, and who had decided, in that moment, that he was no longer going to be underestimated tonight. "I am not going to address this through the floor manager. I would like to speak with Margaret. Please go to the kitchen, tell her that an inspector from the guide is in the dining room and would like a brief word with her at the host stand, and please do so within the next 60 seconds. Thank you." The word guide landed in the foyer like a stone dropped into a deep well. Anthony's face did several things in quick succession. The professional mask flickered. The sneer evaporated. Something underneath the sneer, something he had not allowed himself to feel in 18 years of running front doors, began to surface for the first time. It was not yet fear. It was the beginning of the calculation that precedes fear. The realization that the situation he was standing inside might not be the situation he thought it was. He looked at Donald. He looked at the small leather notebook in Donald's right hand. The notebook was red. It was the specific shade of red that was used by the Michelin Guide for the personal inspection notebooks issued to its working inspectors. Anthony had seen photographs of the notebook in trade publications over the years. He had heard about it from other maitre d's who had claimed, in various levels of believability, to have spotted one in their own dining rooms. He had never seen one in person. He was seeing one now. He looked back at Donald. "Sir, I would be happy to get the chef. May I confirm, you are saying you are with the Michelin Guide?" Donald did not answer. He had not been asked the question that mattered. He simply turned his head, slightly, and looked at Pamela for the first time since he had arrived at the host stand. He did not smile at her. He simply tilted his chin in a small, formal greeting. Pamela tilted hers back. The greeting communicated, to anyone in the foyer who knew how to read it, which, in that moment, was no one, that the two of them were colleagues, and that they were both present in the room in their professional capacity. Anthony, who did not know how to read it, knew enough to understand that whatever was about to happen in this restaurant was not going to be something he could control. He turned and walked very quickly toward the kitchen. The kitchen of Maison Verlaine was, at 8:37 on a Tuesday evening, operating at approximately 92% of its capacity. 23 covers had been seated. 11 covers were in the middle of their tasting menu. The pass was running on schedule. The sous chef was calling tickets in the calm, controlled voice of a man who had been calling tickets in this kitchen for 6 years and who had developed a relationship with the rhythm of the room that was almost musical. Margaret was at the pass. She was 48 years old. She had been the executive chef of Maison Verlaine for 9 years. She had earned the restaurant its third Michelin star 4 years ago, in her 5th year as executive chef, and she had defended that star every year since. She was, by the assessment of nearly every critic who had written about her work, one of the 5 most technically skilled chefs in New York City. She was also, by her own assessment and by the assessment of her line cooks, one of the most demanding. She did not yell. She did not throw things. She did not perform. She simply did not accept work that was not exactly correct, and she had built, over 9 years, a kitchen that was capable of producing exactly correct work for 240 covers a week. She was inspecting a plate of langoustine with brown butter and yuzu when Anthony pushed through the swinging door from the dining room. Margaret did not look up. She had heard the door. She had heard Anthony's footsteps. She had registered, in the half-second between the sound of the door and the sound of his feet, that the rhythm of those footsteps was wrong. Anthony did not come into the kitchen during service. Anthony had not been in the kitchen during service in approximately 7 months. There was no reason for him to be here now, and the speed at which he was moving toward her told her that the reason, whatever it was bad. She set down the langoustine. She looked up. Anthony. Chef. There is a situation at the host stand. There is a man asking to speak with you. He says he is from the guide. Margaret's face did not move. She had been a chef for 26 years. She had learned, very early in her career, that the most important thing a chef could do in a moment of crisis was to keep her face exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds earlier. The line cooks were watching her. The sous chef was watching her. The pastry chef was watching her from the station in the corner. If her face moved, the kitchen would know that something was wrong, and the kitchen would begin to make small mistakes, and those small mistakes would compound, and within 10 minutes the service would be in trouble. Her face did not move. She wiped her hands on the towel tucked into her apron. She walked around the pass. She walked toward the swinging door at a pace that was identical to the pace at which she always walked through her kitchen, which was unhurried and absolutely deliberate. She pushed through the door into the foyer. She saw the host stand. She saw Anthony, who had followed her, hovering 2 steps behind. She saw a man in a charcoal gray suit standing to the left of the host stand, holding a small leather-bound notebook with a red cover. She saw a woman in a beige sheath dress standing to the right of the host stand, with her clutch placed on the marble surface and her hands folded on top of it. She recognized both of them. She recognized the man instantly. She had met him, briefly, at a culinary conference in Lyon 3 years ago. He had been introduced to her, by a mutual friend, as a consultant who advised restaurants on wine programs. She had spoken with him for approximately 12 minutes about a Burgundy producer they both admired. She had not, at the time, suspected that he was anything other than what he had said he was. She recognized the woman from a different conference. A symposium on food science and culinary innovation at the Institute of Culinary Education in Manhattan 4 years ago. The woman had been listed on the program as a visiting researcher from a private consulting firm. She had given a 40-minute presentation on the chemistry of fermentation that had been one of the most technically impressive presentations Margaret had ever sat through. They had spoken afterward for about 20 minutes. Margaret had asked her where she worked. The woman had said, with a small smile that Margaret had not understood at the time, "I work for a guide." Margaret had not understood. She understood now. She understood with such complete clarity that for a moment she could not breathe. She was standing in the foyer of her own restaurant, on a Tuesday evening, at 8:38, and she was looking at 2 anonymous Michelin inspectors who were standing at her host stand. One of them had been refused entry by her maître d'. The other had stood up from his table in the middle of service to bring this fact to her attention. She did not need to be told what had happened. She had read the same complaint file that Pamela had read, 3 months earlier, when an anonymous summary of it had been forwarded to her by a friend in the industry who had wanted her to know that the chatter was building. She had spoken to Robert, the owner, about it. Robert had told her not to worry. Robert had told her that Anthony was the best maitre d' in the city and that the complaints were the kind of thing that always accumulated around a restaurant of their stature. Margaret had not believed Robert. She had asked, twice, to be involved in the response to the complaints. Robert had told her, both times, that the front of the house was not her concern. The kitchen was her concern. The kitchen produced the stars. The dining room produced the revenue. The two should not interfere with each other. She had not pushed harder. She had, in retrospect, made a mistake. She had let the question go because she had been busy and because the restaurant had been busy and because the easy thing had been to trust that the man who signed her paycheck knew what he was doing. She was looking now, in the foyer of her own restaurant, at exactly how wrong that decision had been. She walked forward. She stopped 2 feet from Pamela. She did not look at Anthony. "Dr. Foster. I am so sorry. Please come with me. Your table is ready." The use of Pamela's title, Dr. Foster, landed in the foyer with the particular weight of a single sentence rewriting an entire scene in real time. Anthony, who had been standing 2 steps behind Margaret, made a small involuntary sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when their body processes a piece of information that their brain has not yet caught up with. He had spent the past 12 minutes telling a woman whom he had refused to acknowledge that she did not have a reservation. He had now just heard his own executive chef address her by a doctoral title in a tone of voice that was usually reserved for the most important regulars in the building. Pamela did not respond to Margaret immediately. She looked at Margaret for a long moment with an expression that was unreadable. Then she looked at Donald. Donald gave her a small nod. The nod communicated, between the two of them, an agreement that had not needed to be spoken aloud, because they had worked together long enough that they knew exactly how this kind of moment was supposed to be handled. Pamela turned back to Margaret. "Chef. I appreciate the offer. I am not going to be dining here tonight." Margaret's face moved for the first time since she had walked out of the kitchen. It was a small movement. The corner of her mouth pulled down. The skin around her eyes tightened. She had been a chef for 26 years, and she knew, the moment Pamela said those 9 words, that Maison Verlaine had just lost something that it was not going to get back. "Dr. Foster. I understand. I want you to know that what happened tonight does not reflect the values of this kitchen. I know it doesn't, chef. I've eaten your food at 3 different events over the past 4 years. I know exactly what your kitchen produces. That is not the question that brought me here tonight." Margaret nodded slowly. She knew. She knew with terrible clarity what the question that had brought Pamela here tonight had been, and she knew that the question had been answered in the 11 minutes between Pamela walking through the door and Donald standing up from table 12, and she knew that the answer had been catastrophic. "Dr. Foster. May I ask? May I ask if you would be willing to allow me to make a statement, on the record, to whatever process follows from this evening? I would like to be on record about what I knew, what I attempted to address, and what was permitted to continue." Pamela looked at her. She was quiet for a moment. "Chef. I am not the right person to give that statement to tonight. The protocols of the guide require that any communication about an active assessment be handled through formal channels. I will say to you, off the record, that I have read the complaint file. I know what you attempted to address. I know what was permitted to continue. I am sorry that you have been in the position you have been in for the past 1.5 years. I am also sorry that I am about to make that position significantly more difficult for you. The decision that is going to follow from tonight is not going to be a decision about your kitchen. I want you to know that, because I want you to be able to keep cooking, in this kitchen or in a different one, with your conscience intact. Your work is exceptional. It has been exceptional for 9 years. That is a separate question from the question of what this restaurant has become." Margaret's eyes were wet. She did not allow the tears to fall. She had not cried in her own kitchen, or anywhere near it, in 26 years, and she was not going to start now in front of a maitre d', who had just destroyed 9 years of her work in a single evening. "Thank you, Dr. Foster." "Chef." "Yes. I would like you to go back to your kitchen now. Your service is still in progress. The diners in that room have paid a significant amount of money to eat your food tonight. They deserve the meal they came for. Please do not let what is happening in this foyer interrupt what is happening in that kitchen. We will speak again. I will be in touch through formal channels. Tonight, please cook." Margaret nodded. She looked, briefly, at Anthony. Her expression, when she looked at him, was the expression of a woman who had just realized that the man who had been seating her guests for 4 years had spent those 4 years quietly hollowing out the foundation of everything she had been building, and that there was nothing she could do about any of it in this moment except to do exactly what Pamela had just asked her to do, which was to go back to her kitchen and feed the people who were waiting for her food. She turned. She walked back through the swinging door. The door closed behind her. The foyer was now occupied by 4 people. Pamela, Donald, Anthony, and the host, a younger woman named Sophia, who had been standing at the secondary stand throughout the entire exchange with her hands frozen over the reservation tablet and an expression of complete horror on her face. Sophia had been hired 2 months ago. She had been trained by Anthony. She had watched him refuse 3 guests in the 8 weeks since she had started, and she had told herself, both times, that the refusals had been about something other than what they had appeared to be about. She was not telling herself that anymore. Donald turned to Anthony. "What is your full name, please?" "Anthony. Anthony Pierce." "And your title here?" "Maitre d'. I run the front of the house." "Mr. Pierce. I am going to give you my card. I would like you to give it to your owner, Mr. Verlaine, this evening. The card has a phone number on it. I would like Mr. Verlaine to call that number tomorrow morning, before noon. The conversation that follows will determine several things about the future of this restaurant. I would like Mr. Verlaine to be available for that conversation." He removed a small card from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He placed it on the host's stand, on top of Pamela's clutch. He did not hand it to Anthony directly. The gesture was deliberate. Anthony understood the gesture. Donald turned to Pamela. "Dr. Foster. Shall we go?" "Yes." They walked out of the foyer together. Donald held the door open for Pamela. The door closed behind them. The foyer was silent. Anthony stood at the host's stand with his hand still half raised in the position it had been in when he had been pointing toward the door 11 minutes earlier. He did not know what to do with his hand. He did not know what to do with the rest of his body either. He stood completely, perfectly, almost painfully still. Sophia, the host, was crying very quietly. She was not making any sound. The tears were simply running down her face without permission. In the dining room, table 12 was empty. The langoustine that had been about to be served to Donald was, at this moment, sitting on the pass under a warming light, waiting for a guest who would never return to claim it. Robert called the number on the card at 9:14 the following morning. He had not slept. He had been informed, by Anthony, at 11:37 the previous night, that there had been an incident at the host stand. Anthony's description of the incident had been incomplete, defensive, and structured around the premise that he had been the victim of a misunderstanding. Robert had listened to the description for approximately 4 minutes before he had asked Anthony 3 specific questions. The third question had been, "Did the man at table 12 give you his card?" Anthony had said yes. Robert had asked Anthony to read the card to him. Anthony had read the card. Robert had hung up. He had then sat at the small desk in the study of his apartment on the Upper East Side and had not moved for approximately 2 hours. He had then made one phone call, to his attorney, a woman named Diane who had represented his restaurant interests for 16 years. The call had lasted 43 minutes. He had then poured himself a glass of bourbon, which he had not drunk, and had sat in the chair in his study until the sun came up. At 9:14, he called Donald's number. Donald answered on the second ring. "Mr. Verlaine." "Mr. Wright. I understand you were a guest at my restaurant last night." "I was." "I understand that there was an incident at the host stand that involved my maître d' and a colleague of yours." "There was." "Mr. Wright. I would like to apologize. I want to be on the record about this apology before we discuss anything else. What happened at the host stand last night does not reflect the standards I have attempted to build at Maison Verlaine over the past 11 years. The treatment Dr. Foster received was unacceptable. I take full responsibility for the conduct of every member of my staff. I am prepared to take whatever action is necessary to address what occurred." Donald was quiet for a moment. He was sitting in his own kitchen with a cup of coffee in front of him and his laptop open. He had spent the previous evening drafting a preliminary incident report. The report had been 7 pages long. "Mr. Verlaine. I appreciate the apology. I am going to be direct with you about 3 things, because I believe directness is going to serve us both better than ceremony this morning. The first thing is that the apology you have just offered is being offered to the wrong person. I was not the guest who was refused service. The apology, when it is appropriate to offer it, will need to be offered to Dr. Foster, through formal channels, in a manner that she will determine. I will not be a conduit for that apology. I understand. The second thing is that the conversation we are having right now is not, technically, a conversation about Maison Verlaine's Michelin assessment. The guide does not negotiate assessments through phone calls with owners. The assessment process is independent and confidential. I am calling you this morning because Dr. Foster requested that I extend you the professional courtesy of an early notification that the assessment process has been completed, and that the conclusions will be communicated to you in writing within 48 hours. That communication will come from the guide's corporate office, not from me. I want you to have time to prepare for it." Robert closed his eyes. "I see. May I ask, Mr. Wright, what the conclusions are?" "Mr. Verlaine. The conclusions are going to be communicated to you in writing. I am not going to preview them on this call. I will say to you, off the record, that you should prepare your staff for a significant adjustment to the restaurant standing. I will also say that the adjustment is not going to be a reflection of the kitchen. The kitchen, in our assessment, is performing at a level that justifies the highest available rating. The adjustment is going to reflect other operational dimensions of the restaurant that the guide considers integral to a 3-star designation." Robert understood what Donald was telling him. He had been in the hospitality industry for 31 years. He did not need the words to be spelled out further. "Mr. Wright. May I ask one more question?" "Yes. My executive chef. Margaret. She has been with Maison Verlaine for 9 years. She earned the 3rd star herself. She has, I am aware, raised concerns about the front-of-house culture multiple times over the past year and a half. I did not act on those concerns. That is going to be on me for the rest of my career. I would like to know whether there is anything I can do, anything at all, to protect her professional reputation from what is about to happen to my restaurant." Donald was quiet for a longer moment this time. He was not authorized to discuss the specific contents of the upcoming guide release. But he had been instructed by Pamela, the previous evening, that if Robert raised this specific question on the call, he was permitted to answer it. "Mr. Verlaine. I am going to tell you something that you may not share with anyone, including Margaret, until the guide release is public. Dr. Foster has elected to write a separate feature profile of your executive chef in the guide's Rising Chefs section. The feature will run in the same release cycle as the adjustment to your restaurant standing. The feature will identify Margaret by name and will describe her work as among the most technically accomplished in North America. The feature will not mention Maison Verlaine." Robert did not speak. He could not speak. "Mr. Verlaine. Yes. Yes, I'm here. Dr. Foster's decision to write that feature was made independently. It was based entirely on her professional assessment of Margaret's work. I am telling you about it now because Dr. Foster wanted you to know, before the release, that the impact of what happened at your restaurant will be contained, as much as the guide is able to contain it, to the parties whose conduct created the situation. The kitchen will be protected. The chef will be protected. The restaurant will not. Robert put his hand over his face. He was 67 years old. He had been in this business since he was 20. He had earned and lost stars before. He had never, in 31 years, been on the receiving end of a phone call like this one. Mr. Wright. Please thank Dr. Foster. Please thank her in whatever way is appropriate. I do not have the words to do it myself. I will, Mr. Verlaine. The call ended. Robert sat in his study and looked out the window at the morning sun on the Upper East Side and understood, with complete clarity, that he was going to spend the rest of his professional life answering for the 4 years he had given Anthony complete control of his front door. He picked up the phone again. He called Diane. He told her to file the lawsuit. The Michelin Guide North America released its annual update 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early November. The release was published online at 6 in the morning and in print form 3 days later. The release contained, as it did every year, a complete listing of every Michelin-starred restaurant in North America, with the new ratings, the new additions, the new removals, and the editorial notes that accompanied each significant change. Maison Verlaine was listed in the New York section. The entry contained 2 sentences. The first sentence noted that the restaurant had been reassessed in the current cycle and that its rating had been adjusted from 3 stars to 1 star, effective immediately. The second sentence read, in the careful, dispassionate language for which the guide was known, the adjustment reflects sustained concerns regarding front-of-house standards and the guest experience, which the guide considers integral to the criteria for higher star designations. The technical execution of the kitchen continues to operate at an exceptional level. The adjustment was the largest single-cycle demotion in the New York fine dining scene in 23 years. It was covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Eater, Food and Wine, and approximately 40 smaller publications within the first 48 hours. Maison Verlaine's reservation book, which had operated on a 6-month waiting list for 9 consecutive years, dropped to a 42% occupancy rate within 10 days. Within 30 days, the restaurant had laid off 17 employees. Within 90 days, the annual revenue projection for the following fiscal year had been revised downward by approximately $14 million. The Rising Chefs feature ran in the same release. It was 4 pages long. It was titled, simply, Margaret Chen, the quietest 3 stars in America. The feature did not mention Maison Verlaine by name. It described Margaret's career arc, her culinary philosophy, the specific technical innovations she had developed over the previous decade, and the particular quality of her work that had distinguished her, in the guide's assessment, as one of the 5 most important chefs operating in North America today. The feature was accompanied by 3 photographs of Margaret in a kitchen, taken by a guide photographer at an undisclosed location, that did not include any branding or identification of the restaurant where she worked. The feature was the highest professional recognition Margaret had ever received. It was also, although she did not yet know it, the thing that was going to allow her to walk away from Maison Verlaine without losing a single increment of the reputation she had spent 26 years building. She read the feature for the first time on the morning of the release. She was sitting at the kitchen counter of her apartment in Brooklyn. She read it 3 times. She then closed the laptop. She sat for a long time with her hands folded on the counter, looking at nothing in particular. She picked up her phone. She did not call Robert. She called the head of recruiting at one of the most prestigious restaurant groups in the country, a man named David who had been quietly contacting her every 9 months for the past 4 years to ask whether she would consider running a new flagship project that the group had been developing in Chicago. She told him that she was now in a position to have a serious conversation. They spoke for an hour and 12 minutes. By the end of the call, Margaret had a verbal offer for a position that would, when finalized, place her at the head of a new restaurant project with full operational authority over both the kitchen and the front of the house, with a compensation package that would be the highest she had ever earned, and with a clause in the contract specifying that no employee in any front-facing role would be hired or retained without her personal sign-off. She submitted her resignation to Robert that afternoon. She gave him 30 days' notice. She offered to remain through any operational transition the restaurant required, on the condition that her remaining time would be limited to kitchen operations and that she would not be required to interact with the dining room. Robert accepted the resignation without negotiation. He did not try to retain her. He understood, by the time he received her email, that retention was not on the table, and that any attempt to retain her would be both undignified and unsuccessful. He wrote back to her with 2 sentences. The first sentence accepted her resignation with regret. The second sentence said, "I have been your employer for 9 years. I should have been your advocate. I was not. I am sorry." Margaret read the email. She did not respond to it. She forwarded it to her attorney for the file. She returned to work. The lawsuit against Anthony had been filed 3 weeks earlier. The complaint had been 17 pages long. It had alleged, with detailed factual support, a sustained pattern of front-of-house conduct that had constituted a material breach of Anthony's employment agreement, including the duty of fidelity to the financial interests of the restaurant. The damages sought were substantial. Anthony had retained his own attorney. The case had settled within 6 weeks, on terms that were not publicly disclosed. The settlement included a confidentiality clause. It also included, as a non-negotiable condition imposed by Robert through his attorney, a permanent industry restriction. Anthony agreed, as part of the settlement, that he would not seek or accept employment in any guest-facing role in the hospitality industry for the remainder of his professional life. The restriction was enforceable through liquidated damages provisions that made any future hospitality employment financially impossible for him to risk. He moved to a smaller city in another state within 4 months. He took a job in commercial real estate. He did not, to anyone's knowledge, ever speak publicly about what had happened at Maison Verlaine. The story did not stay quiet. It had been recorded by the diner at table 4, who had uploaded a 40-second clip of the foyer exchange to social media within 20 minutes of leaving the restaurant. The clip had been viewed approximately 6 million times within the first week. By the time the guide release was published, the clip had been viewed 23 million times. The diner at table 4 was, although she did not know it at the time, going to receive a personal letter of thanks from the Michelin Guide North America, delivered through her social media account, 6 weeks after the release. The letter would simply say, "Your decision to document what you witnessed contributed to a process that has resulted in meaningful change. We thank you for your attention. We thank you for not looking away." She would frame the letter. She would not tell anyone whom it was from. A year passed. Pamela did not think about Anthony very often. She had a guide to run. She had 240 restaurants on her annual assessment calendar across North America. She had a team of 14 inspectors reporting to her. She had a husband she loved, 2 large rescue dogs that required a great deal of attention, and a small kitchen garden on the roof of her apartment building in Brooklyn that she tended on Sunday mornings with the precise patience she brought to everything she did. She did, however, think about the Maison Verlaine assessment occasionally, because it had become a case study within the guide. The internal review that had followed the release had resulted in a complete restructuring of how the guide processed front-of-house complaints. Previously, complaints about guest treatment had been handled separately from culinary assessments. After Maison Verlaine, the two were integrated. The new protocol specified that any restaurant carrying a star designation would be subject to mandatory front-of-house assessment as part of its ongoing star evaluation, and that the front of the house would be weighted at 30% of the total assessment score for 1-star restaurants, 25% for 2-star restaurants, and 20% for 3-star restaurants. The protocol change had been announced quietly, in an internal memorandum to the Guide's Inspector Corps. It had not been publicized. But within the industry, the implications had been understood immediately. Restaurants across North America had, within 90 days of the protocol change, conducted internal reviews of their front-of-house operations. Several maitre d's had been quietly let go. Several others had been required to undergo mandatory training. A small number of restaurants had restructured their reservation systems entirely to remove the discretion of any single individual at the door. The change had not been called the Maison Verlaine Protocol. It had been called, internally, Protocol 12, after the table at which Donald had been seated on the evening that had triggered the review. The number had been Donald's suggestion. Pamela had accepted it. The number had been the only public marker that anyone outside the guide would ever associate with the case, and it would not have meant anything to anyone outside the guide. Inside the guide, however, it meant everything. Margaret had opened her new restaurant in Chicago 7 months after leaving Maison Verlaine. The restaurant was called Verity. It seated 38 guests per service. It served a single tasting menu that changed every 2 weeks. The dining room was managed by a maitre d' named Linda, whom Margaret had personally recruited from a small farm-to-table restaurant in Portland, Maine, where Linda had been running the front of the house with a quiet warmth that Margaret had observed once, on a research trip, and had remembered for 2 years. The restaurant earned its first Michelin star in its first assessment cycle. The star was awarded by the guide approximately 8 months after the restaurant opened. The announcement was made on a Tuesday morning in early November, exactly 1 year after the Maison Verlaine release. The entry for Verity in the guide noted the technical accomplishment of the kitchen. It also noted, in a single sentence at the end of the entry, that the front of the house at Verity operates with the warmth and intentionality of a restaurant that understands hospitality as a complete discipline, not as a transaction. Margaret read the entry on her phone at 6 in the morning, sitting on the floor of the restaurant's kitchen with her back against the walk-in refrigerator, drinking the first cup of coffee of what would become a 16-hour day. She read the entry twice. She did not cry. She had not cried in 26 years, and she was not going to start now in her own kitchen, even an empty one before service. She did, however, send a single text message. The message went to a phone number she had been given 6 months earlier, through formal channels, after the Michelin Guide had quietly facilitated a confidential introduction between her and Pamela on the occasion of Margaret signing her contract with the new restaurant. The introduction had not been a meeting. It had been an email exchange. The exchange had included a single sentence from Pamela that had said, "Chef, I would like you to have my number. Please use it if you ever need anything, professionally or otherwise. I am not going to use yours." Margaret had kept the number. She had not used it. She used it now. The text message said only, "Thank you." She did not sign it. Pamela read the text message at 7:43 that morning, sitting at her kitchen table in Brooklyn, with one of her dogs asleep on her feet and the New York Times open on her laptop. She read the message. She did not need to ask who it was from. She knew. She wrote back. Her response was also 2 words. It said, "Keep cooking." She set the phone face down on the table. She closed the laptop. She finished her coffee. She put on her shoes. She walked her dogs. She went to work. Donald, the colleague who had stood up from table 12 on the evening that had started everything, retired from the guide 8 months after Verity received its first star. He had been an inspector for 15 years. He was 64 years old. He had decided, he told Pamela on the phone the day he submitted his retirement notice, that it was time to spend more time with his wife, his garden, and the small wine cellar he had been quietly building in the basement of his house in Westchester for the past 20 years. Pamela accepted the retirement without trying to talk him out of it. She knew when a person had finished a chapter, and she knew that Donald had finished his. She did, however, ask him one favor. She asked him to attend, as a personal guest, the press dinner that the guide hosted in New York each November to honor that year's honorees. She told him she wanted him there because she wanted to introduce him, by name, in front of the assembled press and the industry, as the inspector whose decision to stand up from his table one evening had changed the way the guide protected guests across North America. She told him that she wanted to thank him publicly, on the record, in front of every chef and journalist in the room. Donald agreed. He attended the dinner 3 weeks later. She did exactly what she had said she would do. He cried. He did not try to hide it. The room rose to its feet. 2 years after the evening at Maison Verlaine, Pamela stood in a small kitchen on the corner of Spring Street and Cumming Street in Charleston, South Carolina, and watched her father season a cast iron skillet for the last time. He was 76 years old. He had decided, after 36 years of running the restaurant with her mother, that it was time to close. Her mother had agreed. The neighborhood had changed. The rent had tripled in the previous decade. The work had become harder for both of them, in the small, accumulated ways that work becomes harder when you have been doing it for 36 years and you are no longer young. They had announced the closing 6 months earlier. They had set the final service for a Saturday evening in late October. They had invited every regular who had eaten in their restaurant over the past 3.5 decades. 243 people had RSVP'd. The restaurant only seated 42. They were going to serve in waves, all night, until everyone had eaten. Pamela had flown down from New York the previous day. She had not told her parents she was coming until she had walked through the kitchen door. Her mother had cried for the first time Pamela could remember in 20 years. Her father had set down his spatula, looked at her, and said, "Baby. You came home." She had said, "Daddy. Of course I came home." She was standing in the kitchen now, 2 hours before service, in an old apron her father had handed her when she was 9 years old and that had hung on the same hook by the back door for 32 years. She was chopping onions at the prep station. She was chopping them the way her father had taught her to chop them, with the same grip, the same rhythm, the same small adjustments of the wrist that her hands remembered without consulting her brain. Her father was at the stove, seasoning a skillet for the cornbread. He was humming a song her grandmother had taught him when he was 19. The kitchen smelled like brown butter and yellow corn and the particular cleanness of a workspace that had been scrubbed every night for 3.5 decades by the same hands. He looked over at her. "Pammy." "Yes, Daddy. I want to ask you something. I have been wanting to ask you something for a long time." "Ask me, Daddy." He set down the skillet. He turned off the burner. He walked over to the prep station and stood next to her. He was still humming, very quietly, under his breath. "Baby. Your mama and I, we always knew you were going to do something. We knew it from the time you were 4 years old standing on that milk crate. We knew it from the time you took your first order at 7. We knew it. We did not know what it was going to be. We did not know how big it was going to get. We are not in the world that you work in. We don't read those magazines. We don't know those names. We just know you." He paused. He looked at her. "But I want to tell you that we hear things sometimes. From people. From customers who have moved away and come back to visit. From folks at church who have grandchildren who work in fancy restaurants. We hear things. And what we hear, Pammy, is that you are quietly running something that matters a great deal to a great many people. And that the way you run it is the way your mama runs the front of this house. And that the way you run it is the way I run the back of this house. And that there are chefs all over this country, Pammy, who do better work because you are watching." His eyes were wet. He did not look away. "I just wanted to say to you, baby. Before we close this kitchen. I wanted to say it standing in this room, where you learned everything you know. I am proud of you. I have been proud of you every day for 43 years. I just want to make sure I say it out loud one more time, in this kitchen, before we don't have this kitchen anymore." Pamela set down the knife. She was 43 years old. She was the lead anonymous inspector for the Michelin Guide North America. She had eaten in the most exclusive dining rooms in the country. She had made decisions that had moved $14 million of revenue in a single evening. She had taught her colleagues how to stand up from their tables, and how to walk away from food they had not finished, and how to write reports that could change the architecture of an industry. She wiped her hands on her apron. She put her arms around her father. He smelled like the kitchen she had grown up in. He smelled like brown butter and cornmeal and the cleanness of a workspace scrubbed every night for 36 years. He smelled like the home she had spent her entire life carrying inside her chest. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Daddy. Everything I have ever done, I have done because you and Mama taught me how to do it. You taught me how to season a skillet. Mama taught me how to read a room. Everything else, every degree, every title, every fancy job, it is all just an expansion of those two things. I never stopped being a girl in this kitchen. I just got better at protecting other people who are trying to do what you and Mama have been doing here for 36 years. Her father held her. He did not let go for a long time. The restaurant served 243 people that night. The peach cobbler, baked from her grandmother's recipe, by her father's hands, with Pamela helping at the prep station the way she had been helping since she was 4 years old, was served at the end of every wave. 243 people ate it. Every single one of them cried, in their own way, when they finished the last bite. That was the kind of 3-star meal that no inspector in the world had the authority to rate. It rated itself. If this story moved you, subscribe. We tell the stories of the women the world tries to look past, the inspectors, the chefs, the daughters of small restaurant owners and assembly line fathers and 5th-grade teachers, who walked into rooms where they were not expected and quietly, without raising their voices, rewrote the rules of the rooms themselves. Like, comment, and tell us where you are watching from, United States, London, Canada, Jamaica, South Africa, or anywhere else in the world. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, that hospitality is not about who you let in. It is about who you see. And that the quiet kind of power, the kind that does not need you to know it is there, is the kind that changes everything.